Hey there, Dragon Prince fandom. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. I find it just gets harder to create theories the longer you move into a story arc, as more story beats get fleshed out and the narrative kind of has an obvious pathway to the end. So instead, I end up perusing various social media platforms, keeping my finger on the pulse of discussion about characters and plot points, and whether there's really anything worth offering my opinion on. Thankfully, today there is. About none other than the star-touched elf, Aaravos, and whether the big sob story he rattled off at the end of Season 6 is the truth, or another lie to manipulate people around him to do his bidding. And before we get into all of that, we kind of need to take a look at where the story's going. So in a couple of months, we're going to see the next and supposedly final chapter in The Dragon Prince. Unless, of course, that supposed third arc gets greenlit by Netflix. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front, as from what's been said recently, Season 7 apparently needs to do really well to get that renewal, which unfortunately, I have more than a healthy level of skepticism that this will come to fruition. With Netflix's spotty reputation of cancelling projects, and since I don't think the franchise has grown all that much since the first arc in terms of popularity, this seems unlikely. Don't get me wrong, it's not hated or anything of the sort, far from it. But I think the first 3 seasons are the ones that really developed the following of the franchise, and since then, the later seasons have not been able to keep the growth going at the same rate at all. Unfortunately, this is what most successful shows are usually capable of doing. So like I said, there's every likelihood that this is going to be the final season of the show overall, and it won't get greenlit for an additional third story arc, and that's a shame. It dipped in quality a little in the middle there, namely for Season 4, which was noticeably bad, but the most recent season was great in my eyes. It had a lot of rich and important story progression and raised many questions within the narrative itself. Foremost among these questions was surrounding the character of Aaravos, a mysterious star-touch elf who's presented as the main antagonist of the show, and thereby his backstory and motivations. This latest season was truly massive for the character overall, and made him one of the most interesting characters in the show itself, with complex and sympathetic motivations for his path to villainy. When we first met Aaravos way back in those early days where he was simply whispering to Viren with promises of power, and never physically appeared before any of the characters, he was a pretty generic villain overall. He was interesting, don't get me wrong, he had a cool design and an ominous rich voice, but honestly, in animation, those characters are a dime a dozen. If your villain doesn't tick those boxes, then it's usually a sign that you've gone wrong somewhere. Villains are so important, and if they're bland, it throws off the whole story and even damages the arcs of your protagonist. So much so that you can't believe that they're a threat to the hero. That's lame, and it kills stories. Nevertheless, he did tick those boxes, and over the course of the majority of the show's run, he was the Emperor Palpatine type figure, lurking in the shadows and manipulating events, using characters like Viren as a proxy to serve his own ends without us learning much about him whatsoever. He would have his cool moments like when he took out the Sun Elf Kingdom, masterminded Viren's coup of the Human Kingdoms, and the attempted invasion of Zadia, but we are left without really knowing much about what he was, or what he wants. Beyond him simply wanting to escape the confinement he'd been left in for so long. A prison made so watertight because he was deemed a dangerous elf who would cause many catastrophes over the course of centuries. The majority of my interest in his character came from his charisma and the air of mystery that his storyline carried. Not only in terms of his past, but also in terms of his future and where the narrative was going to lead. His arc would determine the direction of the story and the direction of many different characters that we'd come to know and love. It wasn't really until the latest season that we got any sort of answer to these types of questions, where we finally saw some of his backstory, which he revealed to Claudia, concluding his seasons-long scheme to be free of his prison that he'd begun with Viren years ago. As for his story, it's actually one that paints him in a massively sympathetic light. Once, he was just your everyday, regular star-touch elf. Obviously a great and powerful wizard, but he isn't painted as somebody who's cruel or dislikes humans or other elves or dragons. He's a loving father who dotes on his daughter and loves her above all other things. Nothing out of the ordinary so far, gives his character a bit of depth, and shows that he isn't such a terrible guy. Or at the very least, there's something more to his character than just being a generic evil wizard. We learn that his daughter Leola was an elf that was different from the rest, which I guess made her somewhat of an outsider in her people. Despite all of that, she managed to befriend folks of all types, elves, animals, humans. Unfortunately, there was one caveat with the humans. She found their difficult lives distressing. So she was the one who gave them primal stones in order to help them grow as a people and ensure they could live peaceful and beautiful lives. Of course, everybody's least favourite dragon snitched, and so she was brought before the Celestial Court, where the wise and powerful Star-Touch Elves sentenced her to death. When Aaravos begged for mercy and for him to die in her stead, they said he can die with her if he chooses, so he doesn't need to go on alone without her. And they considered that mercy. My god, is there anybody in this show that's more hateable now? Oh, man, it sucks that your daughter died, but hey, try to get over it. After all, we're all just stardust held together by love, yada yada yada. Nah. Get out of here with that shit. Aaravos seems to have a similar view, as he developed an elaborate revenge plot to tear down the Cosmic Order to get justice for those that wronged him, no matter who gets in the way. With this new knowledge, everything that Aaravos became starts to make sense. After all, we as the audience know that whilst he does do some things that seem right, like teaching humans magic so they can develop, and legitimately he helped Claudia and Viren. I mean, can we just talk about his promise to help Viren return to life permanently? Prior to the release of the most recent season, I was pretty firmly in the camp of Aaravos is playing Claudia and Viren like a fiddle, and when he no longer needs them, they're going to be discarded. And on top of that, they have no real hope of actually being able to bring Viren back to life for good. The whole ritual they're doing is a bunch of bullshit, and they're going to end up getting hoodwinked. Now, obviously, that's not what ended up happening, and Aaravos was revealed to be legit, which added more to his vibe. This idea that he has depth, and that there's more to him than meets the eye. Even with that, though, it's not like he's a good person anymore. He definitely sacrificed those early humans to Sol Regum to sow chaos. He killed the Sun Elf Queen in the most brutal way possible, mocking her all the while. And then he burned down Catullus just to keep things chaotic. Just because he's been given a deeply sympathetic backstory, it doesn't give him a free pass to do what he's done and hurt whomever he likes. Doesn't quite work like that. So he has passed the threshold of evil well and truly in my eyes. So it's not a whitewash of his character. Now, with all that set up out of the way, we can get to the crux of the video. I've seen a lot of talk recently. Well, maybe not recently, but it actually seems to be the most contentious plot point that's continuously brought up since the last season released. Whether Aaravos was giving the full truth, or whether he was lying to manipulate Claudia's emotions and get her to do what he wants. After all, to Claudia, her dad was seemingly everything, and he had just died. So in order to galvanize her into supporting him in the future, he concocts a little lie about his daughter. I'll be honest though, I just don't like it, or at least understand this line of thinking. That either he made the whole thing up, or that there's more to it than meets the eye. To me, it's just good writing and it's a great plot twist. I think the majority of the best villains are complex in their motivations. When a character is evil for the sake of being evil, it's not very interesting. Hence why antagonists often get saddled with backstories that are either really interesting and intense, or make you sympathize with them, even if you disagree with their actions. And that's what they do for you here with Aaravos. They give him a motivation and a driving force that makes sense, and that a lot of people can understand, the unjust execution of his daughter. They even go in depth to show her fear at her impending execution, and his grief at her loss. It's not like they had us watch him explain all of this to Claudia, which would have created some narrative distance and thus allowed us to draw our own conclusions as to whether he's telling the truth. We legitimately saw what happened playing out on screen right in front of us. Yes, perhaps some of it would be slightly coloured by Aaravos' perspective on things, but ultimately, we saw it happen. We heard the dialogue. It wasn't told, it was shown. And by doing so, it at the very least cements that those things occurred. Perhaps there's some missing reasons or missing context, but we know that this needs to have happened. Otherwise, it's a massive waste of our time. Narratively unsatisfying to the extreme, and just dodgy writing overall, which reduces Aaravos from complex and tragic villain to the regular edgelord manipulator. I just don't see that happening after we've had such a well-written season. It would actually be heartbreaking to see. On top of that, don't we have actual proof that this occurred anyway? Or at least strong evidence to suggest it did? For starters, Aaravos named Sol Regum as the snitch who dobbed in the little girl to be sentenced to death. Previously, we've seen that Sol Regum just sucks. He sees humans as a lesser form of life, he doesn't care if they suffer and die, and has burned 2 cities down previously, 2 human cities. So it fits his MO that he'd do something like this because he was angry somebody gave magic to humans. On top of that, Aaravos really seems to enjoy causing him pain and watching him die. So to me, it fits. If somebody's just evil for the sake of it, you'd think they wouldn't care about each crime they commit, it would meld together. But Aaravos is taking great pleasure specifically in killing this dragon and taunting him about the death of his wife. That tells us there are emotional stakes behind it all. Aaravos also describes how his daughter was cast from the heavens and smashed into earth, creating a huge crater. He cried over her remains for 100 years, which turned it into the Sea of the Cast Out, as it filled with his tears. Is there not a giant statue of him being consoled by the Merciful One right on that spot? Did we not legitimately see that on screen? Is that not where he was imprisoned in the first place? Seems cruel to imprison him right where his daughter was blasted from the heavens. But considering that the original solution for humans using dark magic was to go full, specieside? That a word? Specieside? To wipe them all out? And that the punishment for giving primal stones to humans was death for Leola, I'm starting to think that elves and dragons are actually enormous assholes. So with all that said, to me it feels rather clear-cut that Aaravos is not telling lies. He's telling the truth of what happened. From both a narrative perspective and also just using common sense, it seems rather obvious. It doesn't make any sense to have him lie. It goes against what we've seen previously and how events have played out and how characters are portrayed. whilst also backtracking on some really cool narrative developments, which would be stupid and a waste of time. It's also worth noting that just because Aaravos has a sympathetic backstory, it doesn't mean he's entitled to be so abhorrently evil. The man's committed so many crimes against people that had nothing to do with his daughter's death. And I think this is where the idea that people want him to be lying comes from, so that his actions can't be justified. But they just can't be anyway. Even though his daughter was killed, he's not in the right for all the loss and destruction he's left in his wake. Overall, this backstory was good, and it had me the most invested of any storyline last season. Writers, keep going down this track. Complex villains are the best villains. Honestly, right now, whilst I want him to face justice eventually for taking out Catullus and whatnot, I also still really want him to destroy those damn star elves. That's the only crime I could justify. So with all that being said, these have all been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the Aaravos reveal? Are you thinking he's legit, or do you think it's all BS? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.